Welcome to Weather Extra. I'm First Alert meteorologist Jillian Johnson. We finally saw some much needed rainfall and cooler fall-like temperatures throughout the past week. But our neighbors to our north, well, they dealt with more of a springtime setup as the state of Oklahoma was battered by severe storms late last Saturday night into early Sunday morning. Severe storms spawned several tornadoes that caused widespread damage to businesses, homes, and schools. Much of the damage was reported in and around the state capital of Oklahoma City, right near the state center, but also scattered elsewhere around the state. You can see some of the damage in Oklahoma City on your screen, where several homes and structures were hit, along with power lines, trees, and traffic signals. Those injured were hospitalized with non-life-threatening injuries. Forecasters believe that at least 7 tornadoes were reported across the region, and based on preliminary reports, 3 EF twisters struck the state last weekend. And residents across the state of Oklahoma began the cleanup process following those severe storms last weekend. Jamison Kiefover spoke with some whose homes were hit, and they say emergency cell phone alerts saved their lives.
Destruction after what people in southeast Oklahoma City thought was a typical thunderstorm. Katie Anderson and her husband Jackson were jolted awake early Sunday morning.
We woke up to the National Weather Service alerts on our phones, and it took us a second to understand what it was.
Debris crashing into their backyard, including someone else's boat. Plus, the weight of the rapid rainfall caused their roof to collapse in multiple places, including just feet from their bed.
I could only see when there was flashes of lightning as we were going, but it was just random things moving. So it wasn't just your normal thunderstorm.
Anderson was living in Shawnee when the April 2023 tornado damaged her home there. She moved to southeast Oklahoma City only to experience another destructive storm less than 2 years later.
The fact that we woke up is a miracle. Every single thing is replaceable, but the people aren't. And so for us to walk away with absolutely no injuries, no issues at all, that to me means way more than whether or not I have a couch or a roof.
In comparison to what some of her neighbors are experiencing, she says they are lucky. Vehicles flipped, lost roofs, or complete second stories gone.
It's really, really bad down there.
Joshua Jetto and his family live in this neighborhood. Thankfully, they're all okay. He tells us they heard the sirens once the storm already hit, but woke up to debris smashing in their windows.
Our grill went flying, everything just destroyed our whole backyard.
Several people said they never heard the sirens, only the alarms on their phones waking them up. Shane Barker said he felt like he and his dog had seconds to shelter before the tornado hit.
I looked outside and within 5 seconds, all hell broke loose.
Several people told us they had to rush to a bathroom or closet without enough time to make it into their storm shelters.
Heard the house being hit by everything, and the house shaking and the roar like you always hear about.
There wasn't much time to even take in what happened overnight. With thunderstorms continuing to roll through while people try to clear debris and salvage what they can.
There's no rhyme or reason to what is damaged in a tornado, and it just feels like a very surreal experience.
The severe weather didn't stop in Oklahoma over the past week. Additional tornadoes were reported at the start of the work week across the state of Arkansas as a Pacific cold front marched through. Check out video of this tornado, which ended up ripping the roof off of some homes in the town of Little Flock Monday afternoon. The community is still trying to rebuild after a tornado hit the town back in May. The mayor said his heart goes out to those who lost their homes and said thankfully the community had plenty of warning before the storm, which he credits for keeping everyone safe. And the following day, on Election Day, a tornado-warned storm hit southern Louisiana, causing damage to some businesses and homes. Debris was seen scattered across the fields, trees and roofs blown down to the ground, and the tornado even caused some walls to collapse. The trail destruction, which you can see on your screen, caused at least 3 injuries to some local residents. Now on to the other top weather stories from this past week. Thanks to some recently cooler weather, leaves are finally starting to change color across central Texas, but we're still not at our peak just yet. But check out the vibrant fall colors that are on full display across the Northeast. Drone footage captured the beautiful fall foliage in the Maryland city of Brookville last week. Trees were filled with vibrant hues of red, orange, and gold. And out across the Rockies this past week, the first major snowstorm of the season arrived. Here's the view in Centennial, Colorado, which is just outside of Denver. Now, Ann Sagebell shared this video of her garden and part of her street covered in snow on Election Day Tuesday. Many cities across the northern part of Colorado picked up more than 10 inches. The Denver International Airport picked up around 4 inches, but even more snow fell later in the week, But those winter storm warnings were put in place across the state, with some seeing totals accumulate to more than a foot in just a few days. And here's the view of Santa Fe, New Mexico, which also was whitened by its first snow of the season on Election Day. The first major snowstorm of the season continued throughout the past week, and several more inches of snow were reported across the state, helping out those ski resorts. And another major weather story we've been following over the past week has been the rapidly burning brush fire in California. Local firefighters said in an hour the fire engulfed nearly 1,000 acres and continued to quickly grow in size. The fire was being fueled by strong Santa Ana winds blowing through the region. Wind gusts reached up to 60 miles per hour. Several people were reported to have injuries, and numerous evacuation orders were put into effect as the fire caused at least one home to go up into flames. And we had our 17th named storm of the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season develop last week. Hurricane Rafael made landfall in Cuba on Wednesday, November 6th, as a major Category 3 hurricane with winds of 115 miles per hour. Rafael is the first major hurricane landfall in the month of November since 2001. It's also the 5th major hurricane to form this year. This storm brought heavy rain, damaging hurricane-force wind gusts, destructive waves, and storm surge to the island last week. Rafael moved into the Gulf of Mexico late last week and into the weekend, and will be something to monitor for areas in the southern Gulf of Mexico early this week. And after months of wild weather impacting the country from coast to coast, experts say the situation is snowballing into what some are calling an insurance crisis. As Lee Waldman explains, natural disasters are forcing some home insurance providers to pull out of states completely. Natural disasters like tornadoes, hurricanes, and wildfires are becoming more common across the country, causing billions of dollars of damage. And homeowners are feeling an extra wave of hardship as insurance companies are leaving several states and taking coverage options with them.
What lessons learned did you take away from Harvey?
Have good insurance.
It's a common theme in coastal communities.
You know, if you want to live here, insurance isn't cheap. That is for sure.
But it's a reality that is quickly spreading across the country.
At least 18 states have experienced significant increases in insurance rates and insurance companies declining to write insurance, or in some cases pulling out entirely.
Dave Jones, the director of the Climate Risk Initiative at UC Berkeley School of Law, says we are currently in an insurance crisis like we have never experienced before.
We're marching steadily toward an uninsurable future in the United States.
Historically, because of things like hurricanes and wildfires, rates for home insurance would go up in places like California and Florida, so providers could still make a profit. Jones says now we're seeing some companies pull out of states like Iowa, Illinois, Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Florida completely because they're bleeding money from natural disaster claims.
They're in a business to make a profit, and the losses are real.
35 states offer what's called a FAIR plan to step in when companies refuse coverage due to high risk factors. Jones believes the federal government should step up as well.
If you had a federally taxpayer-funded reinsurance program, that would reduce costs for the FAIR plans and help them better survive as they're seeing their policy numbers go up.
Straight ahead on Weather Extra, we head out to outer space, where NASA has launched its latest venture to explore one of Jupiter's moons for possible life. We'll have more on this mission when we return. Welcome back to Weather Extra. A mission to study an ocean world where humans could potentially live is now underway. One of NASA's latest ventures launched last month, heading towards Jupiter's moon, Europa. Reporter Michael Yoshida joins us with more on what this mission means for space travel and potentially finding life beyond our world.
Liftoff.
NASA's Europa Clipper spacecraft is heading towards its namesake, Jupiter's moon Europa. Launched aboard a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, the spacecraft is NASA's first to be dedicated to studying an ice-covered ocean world in our solar system.
Given everything that we've really learned about necessary conditions for life, Clipper is going to tell us if Europa has all of these ingredients for life.
Clipper will look at the ocean beneath Europa's thick ice shell. The moon's ocean is estimated to have 2 times as much liquid water as the Earth's oceans.
We have 10 science investigations that are designed to examine Europa, this incredible icy ocean moon, from every different perspective and to give us great insights into whether this could be a habitable world.
The mission has several big challenges. One, just getting to Jupiter, with the spacecraft traveling some 1.8 billion miles. Once there, the planet's complex gravity fields and powerful radiation have to be dealt with as the Clipper does flybys of the moon.
Another challenge is having a solar-powered mission at Jupiter. We had to build these giant solar panels to capture the small amount of sunlight at Jupiter to power the spacecraft.
The $5.2 billion mission began in 2013.
What we learned with Clipper and the habitability of Europa, this is going to pave the way for the future, for future missions to Europa and elsewhere in our solar system where we can search more directly for life.
In Washington, I'm Michael Yoshida reporting.
The moon is more than 230,000 miles from Earth, but scientists say it has never felt closer as they've created a replica of the moon's surface right here on Earth to train astronauts for future missions. CBS's Tina Kraus shows us.
The moon is a star attraction around the world. Millions admire it from a distance.
It's one small step for man,
but only a dozen people have ever stepped foot on it.
one giant leap for mankind.
So scientists in Europe decided to bring the moon to Earth with what experts say is the world's most accurate copy of the lunar landscape.
It's the surface, it's the lunar dust, the rocks, the lighting. We will have a gravity offload system. We will work in spacesuits that limit our movement, limit our view.
This training facility in Germany, built from simulated lunar dust and 900 tons of volcanic rocks, mimics the moon and is about the size of 3 tennis courts. It has a deep floor area which can be frozen, allowing astronauts to practice drilling in search of water ice.
We have everything that we need to test and prepare ourselves for the moon. It's a facility that not even NASA has or any other international partners.
The European Space Agency hopes the site, nicknamed Luna, will attract American astronauts and others from around the world to test equipment and prepare for future missions.
And I think this is quite attractive for them because nothing like this exists anywhere else in the world.
And European astronauts admit they're over the moon about the possibility of one day stepping foot on the real thing. Tina Kraus, CBS News, London.
No Americans have walked on the moon's surface in more than 50 years since 1972, the last year of NASA's Apollo missions. Earlier this year, NASA delayed its Artemis 3 moon landing mission until late 2026. Now, when it comes to electricity production, Texas is a major fossil fuel state, but over the last few years, we've seen rapid development of wind and solar energy production. Up next on Weather Extra is this week's Degrees of Science, where Brady Taylor spoke with the leading Texas energy researcher about where Texas is on this transition to green energy and what kind of impacts this has environmentally and economically. More on this conversation when we come back.
Dr. Cohan, I guess, we talk a lot about wind and solar. How much are we actually producing with those different types of means of producing electricity?
Yeah, wind and solar are growing incredibly fast. Historically, Texas was a coal state, and then natural gas became our leading source of electricity. But over the past 10 years, where the growth has been coming has been wind and solar. And right now, wind is generating more than a quarter of the state's electricity, and solar is hitting 10% for the first time this year and is growing incredibly fast.
Are we seeing much of a drop in the amount of coal that we're using to produce electricity since those other types are going up?
Yeah, the growth of these other sources has really been squeezing out coal from the grid. It's fallen behind gas and nuclear and wind and is soon going to be overtaken by solar within another year or two. So we have seen a few coal plants close, and the coal plants that remain are being run less of the time. They're not the base load coal plants like we used to think of them, but instead they have to ramp up and down their operation or even shut off for a number of weeks at a time because their power isn't needed as much as it used to be.
So you mentioned Texas being kind of a coal state. Where does it sit compared to other parts of the country when it comes to how much we're making that transition to the other sources?
Yeah, we can frame it in different ways. One is just because we are such a big state, such a populous state, and because we use more electricity per person than some states do, Texans consume more electricity than other states and burn more natural gas, burn more coal than other states do. So it's still a major consumer, but we've been transitioning away from coal very quickly.
So is it to the point where we're just trying to find a kind of happy marriage between gas and coal and wind and solar, or is it where we could completely one day try to shift to just green style energy?
Yeah, well, what we need is a portfolio of resources, is the resources balanced together that can keep the lights on. And a combination of wind, solar, and batteries can, as they continue to grow, be the backbone of the grid, but we still will need dispatchable resources. Research that we're doing shows we don't need those coal plants anymore. With a few years to transition, we can replace that output with the newer, cleaner sources, but we do need something that can be flexible, dispatchable power, such as the natural gas plants that we have today, or possibly if the geothermal technologies that are being pioneered out in the Western United States by some Texas-based companies, if those pan out in other parts of the country, it's possible that could become part of the mix in Texas as well.
So a lot of people refer to wind and solar as more green energy. What kind of bad impacts does coal-produced electricity do to the environment?
Coal power plants cause far more air pollution and health impacts than any other source of electricity. And really what is growing concern to Texans is the fact that with EPA's new particulate matter standards, where they tightened the standard, they lowered the standard from 12 down to 9 micrograms of particulate matter per cubic meter of air. That means that we have to do even more to clean up our air faster. And what we find in many parts of the state is that sulfate is the second largest part of those particles. And when we see sulfate in the particles, we know there have to be sulfur emissions causing it. And coal is really the one form of electricity that puts sulfur into the air. Natural gas has its impacts on climate, has other impacts. But when we are seeing sulfate as such a big part, number 2 component of our particles, that tells us we really need to cut back on the sulfur emissions. Unfortunately, Texas, even with the cleanup, still leads the country in sulfur emissions.
So when it comes to transitioning to the greener style stuff, cost-wise for the consumer, what kind of impacts will they see as we go to more solar and wind?
What we found is that wind and solar are now by far the cheapest sources of new electricity. And so already by having them on the grid, they're avoiding some of those spikes in prices that we used to see on the wholesale markets. We don't see prices spiking as high on summer afternoons as they used to. And so there are many, many billions of dollars in costs that are being saved by the wind and solar that are being added. On the flip side, if you look closely at your electric bill, we don't just pay for generation, but we also pay for transmission and distribution. And we already have built $7 billion of lines to West Texas that really enabled that first boom in wind power. And we're probably going to need to add more transmission lines for a few different reasons. One is those lines are filled up, and so to enable more wind on the grid, more solar, we need lines for that, but also because there's been a boom in electricity demand out in the Permian Basin, where oil and gas companies are trying to electrify their operation. We also have growing demand from data centers and AI and other reasons. That's going to require adding new lines to the grid, adding new lines to bring power into our biggest cities where demand is growing fastest. And so we're going to see new investments needed in those lines, even as wind and solar help make the cost of generating power become cheaper.
To hear more from Brady and Dr. Cohan about the transition to green energy impacts have on the power grid on the major use days, scan the QR code on your screen to watch on YouTube or go to kwtx.com/degrees of science. Weather Extra will be right back. Welcome back to Weather Extra. A more than 200-year-old bridge that's usually submerged in a Pennsylvania river is seeing foot traffic once again, all thanks to a drought. The Great Crossings Bridge, which was built in 1818 under President James Monroe. It was part of the national road that connected the Potomac and Ohio rivers. Now, Andrew Havernick spoke to some visitors that traveled to see the historic site.
Hundreds of people have made their way to the Youghiogheny River Lake over the last few weeks to see a rare sight. What brings you out here today?
We saw it online and had to
See
come
the
see.
phenomenon. And everyone has something to say about what they're seeing.
It's mind-boggling to me. We don't have a road that lasts 2 years, let alone 200.
It's hard to fathom how this happens.
The town of Summerfield was buried by water in the 1940s when the Youghiogheny River Lake was built. One of the biggest remnants of that town is the Great Crossings Bridge. This is what it once looked like. Today, it's visible and walkable and is the main attraction at the Youghiogheny River Lake right now. That's because the lake level is down significantly because of severe drought.
We get to walk back in time and see everything that was here before we started our operation.
This isn't the first time the bridge and remains of Summerfield's streets, sidewalks, and even tree stumps have been visible.
I did a quick search and seen at least a dozen different times that this has been out.
The water level does drop in the lake every year around November and then fills back up through the winter months. But this year's drought has dropped the water more than normal, and it's not done.
I would expect that we have the potential for a top 3 low, given the trajectory that we're on now and our forecasts.
They don't believe this will be the record, which is about 20 feet lower than the current water level, which was reached in the 1950s. Still, if you want to see the 206-year-old bridge and remnants of Summerfield in person, you'll have to stop by sooner rather than later. Klinkner says the basin typically starts to fill back up in December.
It's worth the trip.
Well, that's all we have for you on this week's episode of Weather Extra. We'll see you right back here next weekend. Have a great week.